Welcome back. This whole section of the course, we've been working on the components of our pipeline and really building toward this final lesson where we're going to use CodePipeline for deployment. Now, the nice thing is everything builds upon the previous actions we've already taken. So we'll see as we walk through this CodePipeline demo, we need an IAM role for our EC2 instances. Well, we have an IAM role already. We created that in a previous lesson. We need an instance profile. We created that already. So by this point, we've already done almost all of the actions that are needed in our deployment pipeline. So it should be becoming familiar by now. The only thing left to do is really tie everything up in a bow using CodePipeline. So let's do that now. Now, the first thing we need is a repository for our code. We could use CodeCommit, we could use GitHub, we could use S3, and we've covered GitHub and CodeCommit pretty thoroughly. I'm going to use S3. So let's go over to S3, and if you're following along, just need to create a bucket as such, CodePipeline demo bucket. Just name it whatever you want, and of course, just record the name. Now, I have in the bucket a Windows deployment and Linux deployment. We're going to do a Linux deployment. I'll provide links to this zip file. Now, let's go into properties and note that I have versioning enabled. And when you run CodePipeline, you must have versioning enabled. Let's say we have CodePipeline set up, and CodePipeline is set up to detect any changes to your code at the start of the pipeline. So when changes are committed, that's going to trigger CodePipeline to do its thing here. It's important to have versioning enabled. Obviously, when a commit comes in, that's going to create a new version. CodePipeline will act on that new version. Okay, so we're set up in S3 in our repository. Now, we're going to deploy our application on EC2 instances. And what we're going to have to do is launch our EC2 instances and install the code deploy agent on our instance or instances. Let's just open another tab and let's go to EC2. We're going to launch an instance. The Amazon Linux AMI is fine. T2 Micro is fine. Let's configure instance details. Now, let's just keep this simple. We'll just use one instance. And what we want to do is enable public IP, because ultimately this is going to be a website. Now, IAM role. So we need an IAM role that has been configured for use as an instance profile for code deploy. Well, we've done that already in the code deploy lessons. There it is. So again, we've done just about everything required for our deployment pipeline already. The code pipeline's just tying it all together and automating things. We want to install code deploy agent on our instance. So where would we do that? We'd go to advanced details, and this is the user data to install that agent. Note that it's installing Ruby, AWS CLI, and it's getting this code deploy agent from this specified location. This is an AWS provided script. I'll provide this in the course materials. Now let's click next for add storage. We're not going to do anything there, but we are going to add a tag. And this tag is going to be important later on in our process. So let's add a tag. Let's just call it CodePipe Demo. Now let's go to security group. We'll just create a new security group. But remember, this is going to be a website. So let's add some HTTP ingress. And in a production setting, you'd certainly want to tighten this up. This is fine. Let's click Review and Launch. launch again. Let's create a key pair and download, and finally launch and view instances. And before we go any further, we just want to wait for our instance to pass its status checks. Our instance has passed its status checks. Now we're ready to move on in our pipeline. One note, at this point we could SSH into our instance and make sure the deployment agent is running. But let's just move forward. We'll find that out soon enough. One other thing, we can pick and choose what we use in our pipeline. And in this demo, we're just going to skip code build. We've covered code build, and it can be a part of a pipeline, but it is not mandatory. So having said that, let's go over to code deploy. And we want to create an application. I'll just call it pipeline demo. Now remember, we have to choose the compute platform. And of course, we're going to be using EC2. And then we can create the application. All right, the next thing we want to do is create our deployment group. And again, this is all review by this point. Let's give our deployment group a name. Now we need a service role that gives code deploy access to work with our target instances. Well, guess what? We've done that already. Code deploy service role. Deployment type, let's just do in place. Environment configuration. We've done auto scaling groups already. Now we're doing just instances. All right, tag group. Well, let's bounce over to EC2. This is where our tag on our EC2 instance comes into play. So let's select name. There's our tag, CodePipe demo. Deployment settings, let's do one at a time, although we only have one instance. We don't have a load balancer. We can turn that off, and we can create our deployment group. Now, when we were demoing code deploy, we went ahead and created a deployment. Well, we're not going to do that. CodePipeline is going to do that for us. So finally, we're ready for CodePipeline. Let's go over to CodePipeline. And let's create a pipeline. Pipeline name. Now, we haven't used CodePipeline to this point, or we would have an existing service role. We'll just have AWS create a new service role for us. All right, our artifact store could be a default location, custom location. Very important point. This is not the source bucket or the source code. Remember our artifacts. This is further downstream. Let's just select custom location. And I'm just going to select one of my code deploy buckets and click next. Source provider. And we're using S3. Could use code commit, ECR, GitHub. Of course, we're using S3. Bucket name. And of course, it's our bucket we created over here. There it is. Object. That is the name of our zip file. So I'll just paste that and plug it in. I'll provide that zip file, but it's our code, and it's going to be our app spec file for code deploy. And everything we need to deploy our web app is zipped up in here. Notice this is important. Use Amazon CloudWatch events to automatically start my pipeline when a change occurs. And that change is going to be changes to our source code. So let's click next. Build provider. Again, we can just skip code build. So let's do just that. Skip. Deploy provider. Code deploy. Look at our options though. CloudFormation, Beanstalk, OpsWorks, and a host of others. Of course, we're using code deploy. Application name. Now let's just go over to code deploy. Our name is pipeline demo. Deployment group. Once we pick our application name, the deployment group autofills. That's all from code deploy. Next, and review our settings. Everything looks fine. Let's create our pipeline. So we have source and we have deploy. We skipped code build. That's fine. All good with the source. So anytime we make a change to our code, that is going to be detected by CloudWatch behind the scenes, and our code pipeline process will be kicked off. In this case, our source triggers the deploy, and we are deploying a web app to our EC2 instance. All right, so our deploy has succeeded. Now let's click Details, and notice that bounced us back to Code Deploy. So again, Code Pipeline is really just the orchestrator of our deployment pipeline. There's our application. Let's choose that. Everything looks good. There's our revision. Let's bounce over to EC2. So we deployed a web app to our instance. Remember, we have already opened up the ingress for the security group. So we should be able to browse this and verify that everything went well. And there we go. Now this is a demo app and it says deployed to 3 instances. Obviously, we only had 1 instance, but we have successfully used our deployment pipeline and automated everything with Code Pipeline to successfully deploy our application. And with that, we have completed this lesson. Please join me in the next lesson.